The moment you ignore your survival instincts is the moment you become something else entirely. The desert breathed heat like an open furnace, waves of distortion bending the horizon as Ethan Cole adjusted the cracked visor of his suit. The internal display flickering between warning signals and static, temperature reading 128 degrees Fahrenheit and rising, every step sinking inches into the fine, glassy sand that whispered against his boots. And then he saw it. Not a shape at first, just a shimmer out of place, like light bending wrong, until his eyes locked onto her, half buried, upright, motionless except for the faint rise and fall of her chest, skin the color of pale turquoise catching the sunlight in soft, iridescent reflections, too smooth, too perfect to belong to this world. And for a second he thought she was already gone, just another casualty left behind by a war he had no interest in remembering. But then her eyes opened, sharp and focused, cutting straight through the haze, and everything in his suit lit up red. Unknown species, do not approach. Yet he stepped closer anyway, boots crunching over crystallized grains, the air carrying that faint metallic scent of overheated circuits and distant storms. And when he finally stood over her, he saw the energy spikes pinning her in place, not crude restraints but precise, humming with low-frequency power, keeping her immobilized without tearing flesh, controlled, intentional. And that meant this wasn't random. This was punishment. Or worse, a test. And his jaw tightened because he'd seen enough systems like that to know they weren't meant to be reversed by outsiders. Don't, she said, her voice low but steady, accented yet perfectly translated through his failing comm system, her gaze never breaking from his. Touch me and you die. Human. And there it was, the arrogance, the certainty, like she still held the upper hand despite being trapped in a dying desert. And Ethan exhaled slowly, glancing at the warning icons flashing across his HUD, threat probabilities climbing, oxygen reserves dipping, every rational calculation telling him to walk away, to leave this as someone else's problem. Because out here, survival wasn't about being right, it was about staying alive. But his hand moved anyway, fingers hovering inches from the nearest spike, heat radiating off it like a stove coil. And for a split second he hesitated, not because he doubted the danger, but because he understood it completely. Then he grabbed it, the burn biting instantly through his glove, sharp and electric, his teeth clenching as he yanked the device free with a hiss of released energy, the spike dimming in his grip before he tossed it aside. And her breath caught, just barely, the smallest crack in that composed exterior. Why? She demanded, quieter now, confusion threading through the command in her voice. And Ethan flexed his scorched hand, ignoring the sting as he reached for the next restraint, the wind picking up around them, carrying distant vibrations that his suit translated into something far worse than weather. Incoming movement, fast, organized, not natural. And still he didn't stop, because some decisions didn't come from logic. They came from something older, something human. And as the second spike came loose and her body shifted for the first time, he realized he had already made the choice long before he ever saw her. The third spike came free with a dull flicker, and the hum that had filled the air around her faded into a hollow silence that felt louder than the wind itself, as if the desert had been holding its breath and only now remembered how to exhale. And Lyra collapsed forward just enough to catch herself against Ethan's chest, her weight lighter than he expected, her skin cold despite the brutal heat pressing down on them. And for a brief second neither of them moved, his suit struggling to recalibrate around the sudden shift in proximity while her breathing steadied in shallow, controlled rhythm. Not panic, never panic. Even now she carried herself like someone who refused to break. "You should have left me," she said quietly, not as a command this time, but as a statement of fact. And Ethan let out a slow breath, scanning the horizon as the warning indicators on his visor pulsed brighter. Multiple contacts closing in from the north ridge, their signatures too precise to be natural. "Yeah," he muttered, adjusting his grip as he helped her stand, her balance uncertain for half a step before she straightened, taller than him by an inch, her posture shifting as if remembering what it meant to be unbound. "I hear that a lot." And she studied him then, really studied him, her luminous eyes tracing the burn marks along his glove, the way his shoulders angled slightly toward the incoming threat instead of away from it. and something unreadable passed across her expression. Not gratitude, not yet, but something closer to calculation mixed with curiosity. "You do not understand what you have interfered with," she said, her voice lower now, almost thoughtful, and Ethan gave a short, humorless breath. Glancing at the flickering map overlay that struggled to render a path through the shifting dunes, "Story of my life," he replied, already moving, guiding her toward a jagged silhouette in the distance. The broken outline of a structure half swallowed by sand, old metal ribs jutting out like the skeleton of something long forgotten, and the wind picked up again, carrying fine particles that stung against exposed surfaces, reducing visibility to a hazy blur of gold and white. Each step measured, deliberate, his suit compensating for the uneven terrain while her movements grew steadier with every yard, adapting faster than any injured body should. And he noticed that, filed it away without comment, because right now survival came first. Answers later, the ground beneath them vibrating faintly now, not enough to shake, but enough to feel through the soles of his boots, a distant resonance that matched the signatures on his display, closing faster than expected. "Those are not hunters," she said suddenly, her gaze lifting toward the horizon where faint shadows began to form against the glare, shapes too symmetrical to be creatures, too controlled to be random, and Ethan did not slow. "Yeah," he answered, tightening his grip on the small utility pack at his side. "I figured that part out." And for a moment she almost smiled, just the slightest shift at the corner of her mouth, as if his response had confirmed something she had been testing. And then it was gone, replaced by that same composed distance. "Then you should also understand," she continued, her voice carrying over the rising wind. "They will not stop." And Ethan glanced at her, just once, long enough to catch the steadiness in her eyes, the absence of fear, and something about that unsettled him more than the approaching signatures, because people who knew they were about to be caught usually showed it, unless they were not the ones truly in danger. And the thought lingered just long enough to tighten something in his chest before he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the structure ahead, its entrance partially collapsed but still accessible, shadows pooling inside like a promise of temporary shelter. "Good," he said under his breath as they crossed the final stretch of open ground, the air growing cooler by a fraction as the sun dipped behind the metal carcass. "Neither do I." The interior swallowed the light in a slow, dusty haze as Ethan guided her through the broken threshold, the temperature dropping just enough to feel like relief against his skin while his visor struggled to adjust to the dimness, flickering between modes before settling into a grainy outline of rusted structures and abandoned consoles, the air thick with the scent of old metal and something faintly chemical, long dried but still lingering. And for a moment the outside world disappeared, replaced by the quiet hum of a place that had once been alive with purpose and was now nothing more than a skeleton left behind. "Stay close," he said, more out of habit than necessity, already scanning for structural stability, water sources, anything usable, while Lyra moved beside him with a steadiness that no longer matched someone who had been pinned moments ago, her steps silent against the debris as her eyes adjusted far faster than his equipment could compensate, catching details in the shadows that he could only guess at. And that same thought returned, sharper this time. She was not what she seemed, but before he could question it, the distant vibration returned, stronger now, a low resonance that traveled through the walls and into his bones, his HUD lighting up again, with multiple signatures hovering just beyond the structure's perimeter, holding position instead of closing in. And that was wrong. Everything about that was wrong. "They are waiting," Lyra said softly, her voice echoing faintly in the open chamber, and Ethan turned toward her, catching the way she stood now, shoulders back, chin lifted slightly, not like someone hiding, but like someone observing. "For what?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would not make things simpler, and she tilted her head just slightly, considering him. "For you to decide," she replied, and the words hung there, heavier than they should have been, because this was not how pursuit worked, not in any system he had ever known. Hunters did not wait for permission, they did not pause to observe, they acted, and yet out there, beyond the broken walls, something held them in place, watching, measuring, and he felt it then, not through his sensors but through something more instinctive, The same quiet pressure that had pushed him to pull those spikes free without thinking. A sense that the situation had shifted in a way he could not fully see yet. "You keep talking like this is a choice," he said, his voice lower now, more controlled, as he set his pack down and began checking what little supplies he had. Left, water nearly gone. Energy reserves dropping. No weapons worth mentioning. Just tools and stubbornness. And she stepped closer, not invading his space, but close enough that he could feel the faint coolness radiating from her skin, a contrast to the heat still trapped in his suit. "It always is," she answered, her gaze steady on him. And for a second, he almost laughed, because out here, choices usually came down to survive or do not. Simple, brutal, but nothing about this felt simple anymore. The air itself seemed charged with expectation, like the moment before a storm breaks, and he straightened, turning toward the entrance where the light filtered in through shifting sand, shadows moving just beyond the threshold, too controlled to be natural. And he understood then, not fully, but enough. Whatever had been set in motion did not end with pulling her out of the desert. That had only been the beginning. And as he tightened the straps on his gear, ignoring the ache in his hand, he spoke without looking back at her. "Then I guess we figure out what kind of choice this is." And behind him, for the first time, Lyra did not respond immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to feel deliberate before she said quietly, "Yes," as if she had been waiting to hear exactly that. The silence inside the structure stretched thin, like something waiting just beyond hearing, as Ethan moved deeper into the shadows, boots scraping lightly against metal fragments half buried under dust that had not been disturbed in years, his visor flickering as it tried to map the interior but kept failing on the edges, as if the place itself refused to be fully understood. And behind him Lyra followed without hesitation, her presence steady now, no longer the fragile figure he had pulled from the desert, but something composed, contained, and that shift unsettled him more than the distant signatures outside. This place was not abandoned in a hurry, he said quietly, brushing his fingers along a console that still held a faint residual glow, power barely alive beneath layers of decay. And Lyra stepped closer to it, her gaze focused in a way that felt different, sharper, like she was not just seeing, but recognizing. "No," she replied, her voice softer now, almost distant. "It was left, deliberately." And the word lingered as the low vibration outside pulsed again, stronger this time, causing fine dust to drift from the ceiling in slow, lazy spirals. And Ethan exhaled through his teeth, glancing toward the entrance where light shifted as something large passed overhead, not landing, not attacking, just circling, patient. "They are still waiting," he muttered, more to himself than to her. And when he turned back, he caught something he had not seen before, a faint shimmer along her skin, not bright, not obvious, but there, like light refracting through water, reacting to something unseen. And she noticed his stare, her eyes meeting his without flinching. "You are beginning to understand," she said, not as a question, and Ethan shook his head slightly, adjusting the settings on his suit, though he knew it would not give him the answers he wanted. "No," he answered honestly. "I am beginning to realize I do not like what I am understanding." And for a brief second, something almost like amusement touched her expression, subtle but real, before fading back into that controlled calm. "Fear is a rational response," she said, and he let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "Funny thing," he replied, glancing again at the readings climbing across his display. "I am not sure this is fear." And that was the truth of it, because fear came with clarity, with a clear direction to run or fight. But this felt different, like standing in the middle of a story that had already been written without knowing his role in it. And as he stepped closer to the far wall, where a large, half-buried interface panel rested beneath layers of dust, he brushed it aside, revealing symbols that his system could not translate, complex and precise. And yet Lyra stepped forward immediately, her hand hovering over the surface without touching it, her fingers trembling just slightly for the first time since he had met her. "This is older than your presence on this world," she said quietly, and Ethan glanced at her, catching that shift again, not weakness but something closer to memory. "You have been here before," he said, the realization forming before he could stop it, and she did not deny it. her gaze still fixed on the panel as if it held something more than data. Not me, she corrected softly, but my kind. And the vibration outside grew louder again, not aggressive, not chaotic, just present, like a heartbeat echoing through the structure, and Ethan straightened, turning back toward the entrance as the shadows shifted once more, larger now, closer, and he felt it again, that same pull in his chest, that same instinct that had driven him to act without thinking. Only now it was sharper, more focused, and he understood one thing with absolute certainty: whatever was happening here was not random. It had never been random, and when he spoke this time, his voice carried that realization, quiet but steady. This was never about you being hunted, he said, not looking at her, and behind him, Lyra finally let the silence answer before she spoke, her voice almost a whisper. No, she said. It was about whether you would stop walking away. The words settled between them like dust that refused to fall, and Ethan stood still for a moment, letting that truth press in from all sides, heavier than the heat outside, heavier than the warning still flickering across his visor, because this was no longer about survival in the way he understood it. It was about being placed inside something designed, something watching, and he did not like being part of anyone else's design. So what now? He asked finally, his voice low and steady, not demanding, not afraid, just grounded. And Lyra turned from the ancient panel, her hand lowering slowly as if she had just resisted the urge to activate something far bigger than either of them. Now, she said, you decide whether to keep being who you are. And Ethan let out a quiet breath, shaking his head slightly as he stepped past her, moving toward the entrance again where the light shifted in slow, deliberate patterns. Shadows gliding across the sand like silent observers. You talk like that is optional, he replied. But even as he said it, he knew the answer, because he had already made that choice the moment he reached for the first spike, and she followed him, her steps matching his pace now without hesitation, the distance between them no longer measured in caution, but in something quieter, something building without either of them naming it. For most species, she said softly, it is, and that stopped him for half a second, just long enough to feel the weight of it, before he stepped into the edge of the light, the heat hitting him again like an open door to an oven, the horizon stretching out in waves of distortion, and above it, the shapes were clearer now, massive silhouettes suspended in the sky, not descending, not attacking, just present, their surfaces reflecting sunlight in controlled angles that made them seem almost unreal, and his suit tried to classify them, failed, and tried again, each attempt ending in the same blank. Error. Unknown. 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 And he narrowed his eyes slightly, focusing not on the scale of them but on what they were not doing. They were not engaging. They were not advancing. They were waiting, exactly as she had said. You could call them off, he said without turning, and behind him there was a pause, just long enough to confirm the truth before she answered, yes, and the simplicity of it landed harder than any threat, because it meant she had been in control of this moment long before he understood it, and yet she had let it unfold, let him act, let him choose, and that realization settled into his chest in a way that felt less like anger and more like clarity. But you did not, he said, and this time he did turn, meeting her gaze directly, searching for something that would tell him what this really was, and for the first time since he had found her, Lyra did not hide behind composure. There was something open there now, not vulnerability, but honesty. No, she said, because it would mean nothing if I did. And the wind moved between them, carrying fine grains of sand that brushed against his suit and her skin alike, the same world touching both of them in the same way, and Ethan looked back at the sky, at the impossible shapes holding position above the desert, and he understood then that whatever came next was not about escaping them. It was about what he would do knowing they were there, watching, measuring, waiting for the same thing she was, and he adjusted the strap on his pack, ignoring the ache in his hand as he stepped fully into the open, not toward safety, not toward cover, but forward, because stopping had never really been an option for him, and behind him, Lyra followed without being asked, her presence no longer something he was carrying, but something choosing to walk beside him. And as the vibration in the air deepened into something almost like a pulse, Ethan spoke quietly, more to the moment than to her. I never walked away before, and this time, When she answered, there was no distance left in her voice at all. That, she said, is why they are still watching. The heat did not feel the same anymore as Ethan stepped forward into the open, not because it had lessened, but because his attention had shifted beyond it, past the biting air and the sting of light reflecting off endless sand, toward the sky where those immense shapes hovered in silent formation, their presence so controlled it felt intentional, like a held breath that refused to release. And for the first time since he had landed on this world, he was not thinking about distance or escape or even survival. He was thinking about being seen, truly seen, and that realization settled deep in his chest as he slowed his pace just slightly, enough to feel Lyra matching him without effort, her movements now completely steady, as if the desert itself no longer resisted her. "They are not here to take me," she said quietly, her voice carried by the wind, but never lost, and Ethan nodded once. Not because he had known that from the start, but because it no longer surprised him. "No," he replied, eyes fixed on the horizon. "They are here to watch what I do next." And the words sounded strange even as he said them, like he had stepped into a role he never agreed to but somehow fit perfectly. And beside him Lyra glanced at him, not with the distance she had shown before, but with something closer to recognition, as if she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "Most would have left," she said, not accusing, not praising, just stating a truth that carried weight. And Ethan let out a slow breath, his hand flexing slightly as the lingering burn pulsed under his glove, a reminder of a choice already made. "Yeah," he answered, "most would." And he did not add anything else, because there was nothing else to explain, no speech, no justification, just a simple line that he had never crossed in his life. And as they moved further from the shelter of the structure, the ground beneath them began to hum faintly, not unstable, not threatening, but responsive, like something deep below was aware of their presence. And his suit picked it up as an anomaly, low-frequency energy patterns rising in sync with their movement. And he frowned slightly, adjusting his stride without stopping. "You feel that," he said, more statement than question. And Lyra's gaze lowered briefly to the sand, her expression unreadable but focused. "Yes," she replied. "It is reacting." And Ethan glanced at her, that word echoing in his mind. Reacting to what? To him? To her? Or to the combination of both? And the thought lingered as the air shifted again, the shadows above adjusting ever so slightly, not descending, not advancing, but aligning, as if refining their position for a better view. And he shook his head faintly, a quiet disbelief settling in, because this was not how power behaved. Power did not wait. It did not observe, it acted, unless it was searching for something it did not yet understand. And that idea tightened something in his chest. "So what happens if I stop?" he asked suddenly, slowing just enough to test the thought. And Lyra's answer came without hesitation. "Then nothing changes," she said. And he stopped completely, boots sinking half an inch into the hot sand, the hum beneath them stabilizing, the shadows above holding their place. And for a moment the entire world seemed to pause with him, suspended in a quiet that felt almost deliberate. And he looked up again, meeting the vast stillness of those distant shapes. And he understood then that this was not about movement, not about reaching a destination. It was about the decision itself, the act of choosing, again and again, even when no one forced him to. And he let out a slow breath, steady and controlled, before stepping forward once more, the hum beneath the ground rising in response, subtle but undeniable. And beside him Lyra did not look at the sky this time. She looked at him, her expression no longer distant, no longer guarded, but something else entirely, something that carried weight and meaning he had not earned yet, but was beginning to. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, almost reflective. "You do not hesitate," she said, and Ethan kept his eyes forward, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. "No," he replied simply. "I just keep going." And above them, unseen but unmistakable, the formation shifted again, not closer, not further, but different, as if the observation itself had begun to change. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, but it no longer felt empty. It felt aware, as if every grain of sand held a memory of what had come before and what was unfolding now. and Ethan could feel it in the rhythm beneath his boots, a steady pulse that matched neither his heartbeat nor the wind, something older, something watching from below as much as above, and he adjusted his pace again, not to move faster but to feel it more clearly, to understand the pattern forming with each step, and beside him Lyra moved in perfect alignment, her presence no longer a question in his mind but a constant, like the horizon itself, always there whether he looked at it or not. "This world remembers," she said quietly, her voice almost blending into the low hum around them, and Ethan glanced at her briefly, catching the way her skin reflected the light differently now, not just shimmering but responding. Subtle shifts in tone that seemed tied to the energy rising beneath them. "Remembers what?" he asked, though part of him already suspected the answer would not be simple, and she slowed slightly, her gaze drifting across the dunes as if reading something written into the landscape itself. "Choices," she replied, and that word settled deeper than anything else she had said so far, because it echoed what he was beginning to feel, that this was not a path laid out in front of him, but a series of moments being observed, measured, remembered, and he let out a quiet breath, his eyes lifting once more to the sky where the massive silhouettes had shifted again. Their formation no longer symmetrical, no longer distant in the same way, but angled, focused, like a lens narrowing in on a subject. "So they are not just watching me," he said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke. "They are learning," and Lyra did not answer immediately, which told him more than words could have, and when she finally did speak, her voice carried a weight that had not been there before. "Yes," she said, and deciding, and Ethan nodded once, not surprised, not even unsettled anymore, just aware, because that was the difference now. He was no longer reacting. He was choosing to keep moving despite knowing he was being measured, and that changed something fundamental in the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he looked at the world around him. And as the ground beneath them pulsed again, stronger this time, he felt it travel up through his legs, into his chest, not painful, not threatening, just present, like a signal being acknowledged, and he stopped again, deliberately this time, turning slightly to face her, not breaking the rhythm but examining it. "You said this is a choice," he began, his voice steady, "but it feels like it was already decided the moment I reached for you." And Lyra held his gaze, her expression calm but no longer distant, something deeper moving beneath the surface now, something that felt closer to respect than anything else. "It was not decided," she said. "It was revealed," and Ethan let that settle, the difference between those two words carrying more meaning than he expected, because one meant inevitability and the other meant truth, and he exhaled slowly, looking past her toward the endless stretch of desert, the shifting light, the silent watchers above, and for the first time since this began, he felt something unexpected, not fear, not defiance, but clarity, a quiet understanding that whatever this was, it was not trying to break him or test his strength, it was trying to understand. Something he had never thought about before, something he had always done without question, and he turned back toward the horizon, taking another step forward without hesitation, the hum beneath them rising in response, the shadows above adjusting once more, and behind him Lyra spoke again, her voice softer now, almost reflective. "Your kind does not realize what it carries," and Ethan did. Not slow, did not look back, just kept walking as the world around him continued to shift in subtle, deliberate ways. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We usually do not think about it." And the wind carried the words away, but not before something far above seemed to react, not with movement, but with attention, sharper now, more focused than before, as if whatever had been watching had just begun to understand exactly what it was seeing. The wind shifted direction without warning, no longer sweeping across the dunes but circling, tightening, as if the air itself had begun to orbit something unseen, and Ethan felt it immediately, not as pressure but as intention, a subtle change that made every instinct in his body sharpen at once, his steps slowing just enough to register the difference while his eyes scanned the horizon again, the light bending differently now, shadows stretching in unnatural angles that did not match the sun's position, and above them the massive silhouettes adjusted once more, not drifting but aligning with that same invisible center, as if everything, sky and ground alike, had begun to focus on a single point, and he realized with a quiet certainty that the point was not a place. It was them. "Something is changing," he said under his breath, though the words felt unnecessary, because the shift was undeniable. And beside him Lyra stopped as well, her posture straightening in a way that carried a new kind of stillness, not tension, not fear, but readiness. And when she spoke, her voice was softer than before, almost reverent. "Yes," she said. "They are no longer observing from a distance." And Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting toward the nearest shadow as it tilted ever so slightly, not descending, not approaching, but focusing in a way that felt far more direct than anything before. And for the first time since this began, he felt something close to being addressed, not with words, not with sound, but with presence, like standing in front of something vast enough to notice him, and that awareness settled into his chest with a weight that was not entirely unwelcome. "Feels like they are waiting for something specific now," he said, his voice steady despite the shift, and Lyra turned toward him, her expression no longer guarded at all, the distance between who she had been and who she was now almost gone. "They are," she replied, and there was no hesitation in her tone, no ambiguity, just certainty. And Ethan glanced at her, catching that clarity. "What?" he asked, and for a moment she did not answer, her eyes studying him as if measuring something that could not be quantified. And then she said it, quietly, but with absolute weight. "For you to stop." And the words hung there, heavier than anything that had come before, because they carried an implication he could not ignore. That everything he had done, every step he had taken, every choice he had made, had been leading to this exact moment. And he looked forward again, at the endless stretch of sand, at the shifting light, at the silent watchers above, and he understood what she meant, not in logic, but in instinct. That stopping was not just about pausing. It was about surrendering the one thing that had defined him from the beginning, the refusal to walk away. And he let out a slow breath, feeling the air move through him, grounding him in something real, something simple. And then he shook his head slightly, almost to himself. "That is not going to happen," he said, not loudly, not defiantly, just as a fact. And the moment the words left him, the world responded, the hum beneath his feet rising sharply, the air tightening, the shadows above shifting in a synchronized motion that sent ripples of light across the sky, not aggressive, not threatening, but undeniable, like a reaction that could not be held back any longer. And Ethan did not step back, did not brace, did not even change his stance. He simply stood there, steady, grounded, as if the reaction itself was something he had already accepted. And beside him Lyra watched him, not the sky, not the shifting world around them, but him, her expression filled with something deeper now, something that had moved beyond curiosity or calculation into recognition. And when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a quiet intensity that matched the moment. "Then you understand," she said, and Ethan kept his eyes forward, the light reflecting off the endless horizon. "No," he replied softly, "but I know who I am." And above them, something vast seemed to pause, not in movement, but in intention, as if that answer had reached further than anything else he had said. The reaction did not fade. It deepened, not louder but more precise, as if the entire world had narrowed its focus into a single, unbroken line that ran straight through Ethan where he stood, unmoving. And for a moment time felt stretched, each second expanding just enough for him to notice details he would have missed before. The way the air no longer drifted but held its place, the way the heat no longer pressed but surrounded, and above all, the way the massive forms in the sky had stopped, shifting entirely, locked in position as if awaiting confirmation of something they could not yet define. And Ethan let out a slow breath, steady, controlled, grounding himself in the simplest truth he knew, that he was still here, still standing, still choosing. And beside him Lyra did not move either, her presence calm but charged, like a current just beneath the surface. "This is the moment," she said softly, not to warn him, not to guide him, but to acknowledge what had already arrived. And Ethan nodded once, his eyes still fixed forward, because he could feel it too, not as fear, not as pressure, but as clarity, a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be forced upon him. It would be answered by him. And that realization settled deeper than anything else. Then let them see it, he said under his breath, and as if the world itself had been waiting for those words. The ground beneath his feet responded again, not with vibration this time, but with something smoother, a shift in the way it held him, as if it was no longer resisting his weight but supporting it. And he took a single step forward, slow, deliberate, and the change was immediate, the air tightening, the light bending, the shadows above reacting in a synchronized motion that felt less like observation and more like recognition, and Ethan felt it then, not in his suit, not in the environment, but inside his own chest, a steady, unwavering certainty that had always been there, but had never been seen by anything beyond his own kind, until now, and he did not stop, did not hesitate, taking another step, and another, each movement echoing through the world around him in ways he could not explain but no longer needed to, because explanation was not what this required. It required presence, intention, choice, and beside him Lyra watched him with an intensity that had nothing to do with curiosity anymore, her expression open, unguarded, something deeper than respect forming in the quiet space between them. They feel it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, and Ethan exhaled slowly, not asking what she meant, because he already knew. They were not reacting to his movement. They were reacting to the reason behind it, to the absence of hesitation, to the refusal to yield even when faced with something beyond comprehension. And that was when the sky changed, not dramatically, not violently, but unmistakably. One of the massive silhouettes shifted forward, not descending but aligning directly above him, its surface catching the sunlight in a way that made it seem almost transparent for a fraction of a second, revealing layers beneath that hinted at structure, at design, at something far more complex than a simple vessel. And Ethan stopped again, not out of fear, but because this felt like the answer to the question that had been forming since the beginning, and the silence that followed was complete, absolute, as if the entire world had paused to listen, and then, without sound, without motion, something passed between them, not a signal his suit could read, not a language he could translate, but a presence that reached into the space of his awareness and simply observed, not his body, not his equipment, but the pattern of his choices, the path he had taken to reach this point. And Ethan did not resist it, did not pull away. He simply stood there, steady, grounded, allowing it to see exactly what he was. And beside him Lyra lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement of something far greater than either of them. And when the presence withdrew, as quietly as it had arrived, the sky shifted once more, the massive form easing back into position. And for the first time since this began, the weight in the air lessened, not gone, but changed, and Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his shoulders relaxing just slightly as the world resumed its quiet motion. And he glanced at Lyra, catching the way she looked at him now. No distance, no calculation, just something clear and undeniable. And when she spoke, her voice carried a softness that had not been there before. "They understand," she said, and Ethan looked back at the horizon, the endless stretch of desert now feeling different in a way he could not fully name. "Good," he replied quietly, "because I was not going to change." The desert did not return to what it had been before. It could not, because something fundamental had shifted in the space between presence and understanding, and Ethan felt it in the way the air moved again, no longer circling with that tight, deliberate focus, but loosening, expanding, as if whatever had been holding it in place had finally released its grip. And he stood there for a moment longer, letting that change settle into him, not questioning it, not chasing it, just acknowledging that it had happened. And beside him Lyra remained still, her gaze lifted toward the sky where the massive forms had begun to drift, not retreating, not disappearing, but repositioning in a way that felt less like surveillance and more like conclusion. "It is done," she said quietly, and her voice carried something new now, not distance, not calculation, but a quiet certainty that felt earned rather than assumed. And Ethan let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders slightly as the tension that had built without his noticing began to ease, though not completely, because some part of him understood that this was not an ending. It was a transition. "Feels like it," he replied, his eyes following the movement above as one of the larger silhouettes shifted farther back, its presence no longer centered on him, And for the first time since he had stepped into this desert, he did not feel watched in the same way, not measured, not tested, just acknowledged, and that difference mattered. More than he expected. They have what they needed, Lyra continued, her tone steady, and Ethan glanced at her, catching the way she stood now, fully composed, fully present, not the figure he had found pinned beneath the sun, but something far more complete, something that had always been there beneath the surface. And what was that? He asked, though he suspected the answer would not be something simple or easily defined. And she met his gaze without hesitation. Proof, she said, and the word landed with a weight that carried beyond explanation, because it did not describe an object or a result. It described a truth, something observed and confirmed, something that could not be taken or given, only witnessed, and Ethan nodded slowly, letting that settle, his mind tracing back through the choices he had made without thinking, the actions that had felt natural to him but had now been seen as something else entirely, something worth watching, worth waiting for. And now, he said after a moment, his voice quieter, what happens to you? And for the first time since he had met her, Lyra did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting away from him, out toward the horizon where the light stretched endlessly across the dunes. And when she did speak, her voice carried a softness that had not been there before, not weakness, but something closer to reflection. Now I return, she said, and Ethan felt something in his chest tighten slightly, not enough to change his expression, not enough to stop him from breathing steady, but enough to register, because somewhere along the way, this had stopped being just about a stranger in the desert, and he nodded once, accepting it without question, because that was what he did. He accepted what was in front of him and kept moving. Figured as much, he replied, and she looked back at him then, her expression open, clear, no distance left between them at all. And you, she asked quietly, what will you do? And Ethan turned his gaze forward again, the horizon stretching out in that same endless line, unchanged and yet entirely different. And he adjusted the strap on his pack, the small, familiar motion grounding him in something simple, something human. Same thing I always do, he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a steady truth that had carried him this far and would carry him further still. Keep going. And the wind moved across the desert once more, no longer circling, no longer holding, just flowing. And above them the last of the distant shapes shifted into the light, their presence no longer heavy, no longer pressing, but still there, watching in a different way. And Lyra studied him for a long moment, as if committing something to memory, before she spoke again, her voice softer than it had ever been. That is why it mattered, she said, and Ethan did not respond, because he did not need to. He simply took another step forward, the sand shifting beneath his boots in a familiar rhythm, the world opening ahead of him once more, and for the first time since this began, nothing stood in his way, not because the universe had changed, but because it had finally understood what he would do regardless of it. The distance between them did not feel like distance anymore. Even as Ethan continued forward and Lyra remained where she stood, the desert stretching wider with each step he took, the horizon pulling him back into the life he had always known. Yet something had changed in the space behind him, something that did not fade with movement, and he could feel it without turning, a quiet presence that lingered like heat after sunset, not demanding, not calling, just there, and he slowed slightly, not stopping, just enough to acknowledge that the moment was not as simple as walking away, because it had never been about leaving. It had been about choosing, again and again, and now there was a new choice forming in the silence between them, one that had nothing to do with survival or instinct, but with something far more difficult to define. And he exhaled slowly, the air dry and warm against his lips, grounding him as he finally stopped, the sand settling around his boots in a soft, familiar shift. And for a moment he just stood there, facing forward, letting the weight of that decision settle without rushing it, without forcing it into something smaller than it was. And behind him Lyra did not speak, did not move, her presence steady, patient, as if she understood that this was not something that could be guided or influenced, only witnessed. And Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, not in hesitation but in clarity, because the path ahead was easy. It was always easy. Keep going, keep moving, keep surviving. But the path behind him was something else now, something he had not expected to carry, and when he opened his eyes again, the horizon looked the same, endless and open, but it did not feel complete, and that was enough for him to turn, slow and deliberate. The motion simple but heavy with meaning, and when he faced her again, the distance between them felt different, not something to cross, but something already understood, and Lyra met his gaze without surprise, as if she had known this moment would come, not because she expected it, but because she recognized the pattern that led to it. And for a long second neither of them spoke, the wind moving gently between them, carrying nothing but the quiet of a world that had already seen what it needed to see. And Ethan took a step back toward her, then another, not rushed, not uncertain, just steady. And when he stopped again, it was closer than before, close enough that the space between them felt intentional rather than accidental. And he glanced briefly at the sky, where the distant shapes still lingered, no longer focused, no longer pressing, but still present, still aware, and he shook his head faintly, a quiet disbelief settling into something almost like acceptance. "You could have left at any time," he said, his voice calm, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what had always been true, and Lyra's expression softened slightly, not with regret, not with apology, but with something deeper, something that acknowledged the truth without needing to defend it. "Yes," she replied, and Ethan nodded once, because that was what mattered, not what she had done, but what she had chosen not to do, and he looked at her for another moment, really looked this time, not at the differences, not at the unfamiliar, but at the presence she carried, the same kind of steadiness he recognized in himself, and he exhaled quietly, the decision settling fully into place without resistance. "Then do not," he said simply, and the words were not an order, not even a request, they were an offering, a choice returned, and for the first time since this began, Lyra's composure shifted completely, not breaking, but opening, something real moving through her expression that had been held back until now, and she stepped forward just slightly, closing that final gap, not because she had to, but because she chose to, and when she spoke, her voice carried a softness that matched the moment perfectly. "You would stay," she said, and Ethan shook his head once, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, not from humor, but from understanding. "No," he answered, "I would not leave you behind." And above them, unseen but undeniable, something vast seemed to pause again, not in observation this time, but in recognition of something that had gone beyond the test, beyond the proof, into something neither of them had planned, and the desert, for the first time, felt quiet in a way that was no longer waiting. The space between them closed without force, without urgency, as if the decision itself had already bridged it long before their steps did, and Ethan stood there facing Lyra with the quiet certainty that nothing about this moment needed to be explained, not to her, not to whatever still lingered above them, because the choice had already been made in the only way that mattered, through action, and the desert around them seemed to recognize it, the wind softening into a steady current that no longer circled or pressed, just moved, carrying heat and light in a way that felt natural again. And for the first time since he had arrived, the world felt less like a stage and more like a place. "You understand what this means," Lyra said, her voice calm but carrying a depth that reached beyond the words themselves, and Ethan nodded slightly, not because he knew every consequence, but because he understood enough. "It means I do not walk away," he replied, and there was no weight in his tone, no sense of burden, just a simple truth that had followed him across every place he had ever been. And she studied him for a moment longer, her gaze steady, searching not for doubt, but for anything that might resemble hesitation, and finding none. Something in her expression shifted again, not the composure she had worn before, but something quieter, something real. "Then it will change everything," she said, and Ethan let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh if there had been humor in it. "Seems like it already has," he answered, glancing briefly toward the sky where the distant shapes still held their position, but differently now, no longer aligned, no longer focused, their presence less defined, as if whatever purpose had drawn them here had reached its end. And as he looked, one of them moved, not sharply, not dramatically, but with a smooth, deliberate motion that carried intention, drifting lower by just enough to be felt rather than measured, and the air responded. Instantly, not tightening this time, but opening, like a space being made, and Ethan felt it in his chest again, that same quiet awareness, but now it carried something new, not observation, not evaluation, but acknowledgement, and beside him Lyra lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in recognition of something far greater than either of them. "They are not leaving," she said softly, and Ethan shook his head once, eyes still on the shifting sky. "No," he replied. "They are just not watching anymore." And the distinction mattered, because what remained did not feel like scrutiny. It felt like presence, like something that had learned what it came to learn and now stood in a different kind of silence. And the ground beneath them responded again, not with a pulse, not with a hum, but with stillness, a deep, settled calm that spread outward from where they stood, as if the world itself had reached a point of balance. And Ethan exhaled slowly, letting that calm settle into him. The heat no longer oppressive, the light no longer blinding, just part of the space he occupied. And he turned his gaze back to Lyra, meeting her eyes without distance, without hesitation, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say that would add to what had already been shown. And when she finally stepped closer, closing the last fraction of space between them, it was not out of need, not out of uncertainty, but because she chose to stand there, beside him, equal in that shared moment. "You changed something they could not define," she said quietly, and Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering that, before giving a small, almost dismissive shake. "No," he replied. "I just did what I always do." And she held his gaze, the faintest hint of something like wonder passing through her expression before settling into something deeper, something that would not fade as easily as the moment around them. And above them the sky remained open, vast and quiet, the shapes no longer shifting, no longer aligning, just there, part of a universe that had, for the first time, paused long enough to understand what it meant to choose without being asked. The desert held its breath in a way that felt final, not waiting, not watching, just existing in a quiet that carried weight without pressure. And Ethan stood beside Lyra as the last traces of that unseen presence settled into something permanent, something that would not fade with distance or time. And for a moment he did nothing at all, no movement, no words, just the steady rhythm of his breathing and the warmth of the sun against his skin, grounding him in the simplest truth he had always known, that he was here, and that was enough. And beside him Lyra remained just as still, her gaze lifted toward the horizon now instead of the sky, as if whatever had been above them no longer needed her attention. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet certainty that felt different from before, not distant, not measured, but resolved. "They will remember this," she said, and Ethan gave a small nod, not looking at her, his eyes tracing the endless stretch of sand ahead. "Good," he replied softly, "so will I." And the words settled into the space between them without needing anything more, because memory was not about holding on to moments. It was about carrying what they meant forward, and that was something he understood, without needing to explain. And after a long second he shifted his weight slightly, the familiar motion signaling something simple and inevitable, movement, not away from her, not away from what had happened, but into whatever came next. And Lyra turned toward him as he did, her expression calm, open, no longer shaped by expectation or test, but by choice, the same choice that now stood between them, equal and unspoken. And for the first time since this began, neither of them was waiting for the other to decide, because they already had. And Ethan took a step forward, not leading, not guiding, just moving, and she matched him without hesitation, their pace aligning naturally as if it had always been that way. Two separate paths settling into one without effort, and the desert opened around them, no longer a place of trial or observation, but simply a place, vast and quiet and real. And above them the distant shapes remained, no longer shifting, no longer aligning, just part of the sky, their presence no heavier than the clouds that did not exist here. And Ethan glanced up once, just briefly, acknowledging them in the same way he acknowledged everything else, without reverence, without fear, just awareness. And then he looked forward again, because that was where he had always been heading, not toward something specific, but toward whatever came next, and Lyra walked beside him in that same direction, her steps steady, her presence no longer something he had chosen to protect, but something that had chosen to stand with him, and the difference mattered in a way that words could not hold. And as they moved further into the open horizon, the wind picked up again, gentle this time, carrying the heat in long, steady waves that brushed against them without resistance. And for a moment Ethan closed his eyes, just briefly, feeling it, the warmth, the movement, the quiet. And when he opened them again, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. And he let out a slow breath, the faintest hint of something like a smile touching his expression before fading back into that steady calm. And beside him Lyra spoke one last time, her voice softer than the wind itself, but clear, unmistakable. "You were never meant to conquer the stars," she said, and Ethan did not look at her, did not slow, did not change his pace, because he did not need to. He already understood what came next, and when he answered, his voice was quiet, almost lost in the open space around them, but it carried further than either of them could see. "No," he said, "just to remind them what we are for." And the desert stretched endlessly ahead, silent and vast, and for the first time, it did not feel empty.